Hello, everyone. Today's lecture is going to be called Organizing the Unorganized. We're going to be jumping around a little bit in this lecture, talking about a bunch of different industries that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about this semester. And some of that's for a couple of different reasons, right? The first is that a lot of labor history up until the 1960s and 1970s is pretty heavily dominated, at least narrative-wise, historiography-wise, right? Like people talking about in history, primarily blue-collar labor unions and labor advocacy and this kind of work, right? In the 1930s, we have the sit-down strikes in Flint, Michigan. We have the little steel strikes in the steel industry. Even earlier than the 1930s, we have the Battle of Blair Mountain and the Colorado coal wars with the mining industry. Before that, we have the 1877 Great Railroad Strike in the railway industry. So a lot of these strikes, a lot of these labor contestations are primarily over blue-collar work. And, you know, for a lot of the national history, blue-collar work was the majority of work performed. It was the majority of the quote-unquote unskilled labor that might draw someone to mass unionization, the other kind of unionization that we see a lot of at this time, if it's not community or industrial based, is in craft industries. Craft industries are, of course, a little different. If you're blue collar and working with your hands, even then you're probably more inclined to join a labor union because you're literally selling that skill, that special craft as your labor. If you're a white collar skilled craft worker, you very well might be in a supervisory role or in management. There aren't a lot of very sizable bureaucracies in the pre-war era that necessitate mass unionization to the point where labor unions become like incredibly large. There's always, of course, there's exceptions to the rule or rules to the exception. But with the 1950s and 1960s and kind of labor finding a more prominent role in American government and society, there starts to emerge calls on the part of industries that aren't usually seen as organizable, that aren't really seen as union industries. There are calls made to organize those industries. And of course, if you've been reading along with specifically Dr. Pfau's chapter, Lost Opportunities, if you've gotten to that chapter yet, or if you're going to be reading it after this lecture, you'll start to see how the labor movement doesn't really adapt to these calls as quickly as they may have been able to. And a lot of this is just a result of a hangover of these common conceptions that some industries just aren't organizable. George Meany, who is the head of the AFL-CIO, of course, famously said that the labor movement just needed to deal with the fact that some workers just couldn't be organized. There are people who believe this today. There are people who seriously refute this idea today. It's not a settled issue. There are still people who believe that there are certain types of workers who can't be organized, either legally or just through practical means. There are others who say, no, of course, everyone can join a labor union. It really just depends on the way you see things, the way you see the scope of the labor movement, or what legal power unions kind of have. But in this lecture, we're going to be talking about some of these industries, which in the 1950s and 1960s were widely accepted to be unorganizable. And some of these industries, that perception changes, the legality around it changes, and they do become organized. Other industries are still fighting to achieve union recognition and organization and greater workplace dignity today. And so this lecture might jump around a little bit, but I just ask that you bear with me while we kind of jump from industry to industry. I'll try and keep things more or less consistent or ordered. Of course, before we get started, we have these reading recommendations that I always like to provide you with. I understand that every single one of these reading recommendations may go uninvestigated for now, but later on down the road, if any of these lectures particularly strike your fancy, if you find yourself with a little bit extra time over the holiday break, if you'd like to reward yourself with some extra labor history reading, these are always some good options. The first on the right here is Kathleen Barry's Femininity in Flight, A History of Flight Attendants. A lot of times people talk about the commercial air travel industry and they just kind of assume that it didn't really take off until after World War II, and that as time went on, that the airline industry grew, and so very eventually, as just a matter of fact, probably in the 70s or 80s, you start to see airline flight attendants organized into labor unions. This actually is kind of an oversimplification of the history of flight attendants. You have airline, back then they were called stewards, or more commonly stewardesses. Stewardesses were part of this labor group known as pink collar workers that we're going to be talking about in just a little bit. But airline stewardesses and stewards, which we call flight attendants today, were working as early as the end of the 1920s and in the early 1930s with the first commercial airlines. It's a very interesting historical narrative. There are actually quite a couple books about flight attendants and the history of flight attendant labor activism. This one stands out to me more specifically because just in terms of scope chronologically, it starts a lot earlier and ends about the same time as a lot of these other accounts. So it's more comprehensive, and I think a lot of people will get a greater kick out of reading it. The other reading recommendations here on the left is Pramila Nadason's Household Workers Unite, The Untold Story of African-American Women Who Built a Movement. Domestic workers, household workers also kind of fell into this category that a lot of organizers viewed as unorganizable at the time, known as the pink collar labor group. Domestic workers specifically were also discriminated against in the labor movement and society at large on racial basis, right? So the idea that domestic workers are largely African-American if you were in the South or the Midwest or the Northeast, and they were more commonly Latin American coming from south of the border if you were further out west. But either way, kind of these racial differences kind of creating a barrier between domestic workers and the rest of the predominantly white working class that viewed domestic workers as outside the purview of labor unions and organizing. Contrary to these popular misconceptions, there are a couple of notable activists who take the charge and try to, for lack of a better word, organize domestic workers, even though domestic workers aren't covered under the Wagner Act. Basically fighting to maintain workplace dignity, workplace safety regulations, certain specified wage levels, even if they're not codified into law, like a de facto wage minimum that domestic workers can expect going into working in someone's individual homes or working in a series of homes, how they can expect to be compensated a given amount. Both of these industries we're going to be talking a little bit about later in the lecture, though, so I don't want to get too much into this right here. But let's talk about who is unorganizable, right? So as the 1960s and 1970s drew on, the labor movement finds itself increasingly divided about issues regarding civil rights. You may recall from our last lecture and its kind of accompanied readings of the labor movement in revolt and in rebellion in the 1970s. You have organizations like the United Auto Workers who are taking an incredibly progressive stance towards the civil rights movement. The UAW and the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, for example, their two leaders are the only two labor leaders who attend Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral in 1968. In 1968, that same year, they leave the AFL-CIO, form their own labor organization. They say the AFL-CIO is too undemocratic. They aren't supportive of the civil rights movement enough. Of course, at the same time, you look at the UAW and the Teamsters, and they have their own reform caucuses, right? The League of Revolutionary Black Workers, the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, and the UAW is looking at UAW's leadership and saying, you're not doing enough to confront racism. you know, you have these ideas of liberal reform and gradual improvement, but people are dying in these outdated auto plants in inner cities. The companies don't really feel like they have to improve. So where's the solidarity there? Teamsters, of course, have their own reform caucus, the Teamsters for a Democratic Union. That reform caucus also seeking to kind of address racial issues, but also additionally perceive corruption within the union, allegations that the union is undemocratic. So there's a lot of debate, right? It's not even just one side against the other, but there are multiple sides, right? You have the UAW, you have the AFL-CIO, you have the Drum and LRBW. At the same time, a lot of these unions that, as we said, are more traditionally focused on blue-collar labor. Well, at the time, blue-collar labor is kind of contracting a little bit, right? We talked about deindustrialization. We briefly mentioned processes like automation and globalization, which are definitely going to start picking up even more at this period, though deindustrialization of the Rust Belt and toward the Sun Belt has already kind of taken its toll on some of these Midwestern, Northeastern centric manufacturing blue-collar labor unions. So the labor movement, you know, is definitely after Taft-Hartley, but especially after 1968 and the end of this New Deal coalition, right? You have Richard Nixon taking the presidency, the Democrats are ousted from power. You could, of course, say that, well, you know, Ike Eisenhower was a Republican in the 1950s, but he's what we call a New Deal Republican, where he was a Republican, right? He was definitely anti-communist. He didn't have any qualms about bombing a bunch of Korean cities, but he still believed in the concept of the New Deal, of government intervention in the economy and of the power of labor unions. Richard Nixon is not a New Deal Republican, right? So in 1968, this New Deal coalition falls apart, and very quickly labor is put on the defensive, and this only gets worse as the 1970s draw on. And so the labor movement really has to think about how much resources it has in the 1960s and 1970s, with all of these internal divisions about civil rights and gender equality, and, you know, should a union be a business union or a social union? And look at all of this deindustrialization. The labor movement starts to look at workers who aren't organized, and they start to dismiss them and say, well, you know, that workers in that industry just can't be organized. They're unorganizable. Now, outside of the context of the time, right, of all of these issues pressing the labor movement, you have a couple of other reasons that this label of unorganizable is justified. Specifically, the first one is that you can't organize workers because it's against the law. When the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act is its official name, right? But when the Wagner Act is passed in 1935, there are certain groups of workers that it specifically leaves out from having the right to a union, right? So when Franklin Delano Roosevelt signs the Wagner Act, it allows a worker the right to join a union. The organization campaign, the voting process, arbitration, all of these things are going to be overseen by an independent body known as the National Labor Relations Board. Today, of course, it's a lot more politicized. You have a lot of anti-labor groups sitting on the NLRB because it is appointed by, you know, whichever president is in office. But at the time, there are certain industries that the Wagner Act is leaving out. Those who are left out, for example, are public sector employees. These are employees who work for, you know, the federal government, the state, local governments, all of their different subdivisions, right? If you work for a county, you're a public sector worker. If anyone here hasn't taken like basic macroeconomics, I've thrown around terms like supply and demand side economics. Public and private sector, basically public sector is economic activity that is orchestrated or organized or run or overseen by the government, right? So the Federal Highway Administration, the Department of Motor Vehicles or Secretary of State here in Michigan, weights and balances, measurements, all of these sort of regulatory affairs. This is all the public sector, right? It's overseen by the public because as a participant in a democratic society, you vote on who appoints these people or you vote for these people directly. And then they hire people who report to them. The private sector, of course, is on the flip side of that. It's purely in the realm of the economy. There's not a lot of public oversight in the private sector. It's private companies. So public sector employees are left out, right? You work for the government isn't going to negotiate with a labor union. We're kind of the law of the land. You also have agricultural workers. You have domestic workers, independent contractors, and employees in air and rail industries. They are actually covered by an earlier law called the Railway Labor Act. So the Wagner Act doesn't really address them. And you also have supervisors, right? It would be a conflict of interest for a labor union to demand that supervisory staff join the union, because supervisors and workers kind of take a not entirely, they aren't necessarily conciliatory, right? A lot of early labor unions were actually formed because of the actions that supervisors took in enforcing, shop floor work rules. So they're usually going to be left out of coverage that's established under the Wagner Act. The exception, of course, is if a supervisor refuses to break the law, then they can be covered by the NLRB. If you work for a retail store and you are told, hey, those workers are trying to organize, you need to find a way to fire them. If you as a supervisor tell your manager, I'm not going to fire them because that's against the law, and that supervisor then discriminates against you, you should, in theory, be able to go to the NLRB and say, hey, I'm being discriminated against. Whether or not they'll actually do this today is different, but that's the reason that supervisors are left out, why they can sometimes be included in that coverage. Now, we're going to be talking about all of these groups of workers today, with the exception of agricultural workers. That is going to be for next week's lecture on the 30th. So we have these limitations that are kind of imposed on who can organize, right? And they're justified for these reasons. The first, of course, is that the Wagner Act legally leaves some groups of workers out. Now, when we talk about public sector workers, right, you have to think about employees and their employer as its own contract arrangement, just as you have to do this, but in the private industry, right? And in public sector employment, there is this idea that if a state hired a worker to, build roads, dig, water drainage ditches on the sides of rural routes, anything related to infrastructure or clerical work or office work or janitorial thing, like all of these things that state and local and municipal and county governments take care of. If they did, if they hired these workers and these workers wanted to join a union, if the federal government were to come in and say, well, yes, they have the right to join a union, a state government could turn and say, well, that's not interstate commerce. You can't tell a state how to run its own labor relations. That's federal overreach. It's a constitutionality issue. In the 1930s, after the National Industrial Recovery Act, this earlier 1933 law, after this is overturned by the Supreme Court, there's a lot more fine detail paid to the constitutionality of laws. And if the Wagner Act would have enabled federal government to come in and intervene in state affairs outside of its jurisdiction, it's entirely possible that the Supreme Court would have overturned it. And so for that reason, as well as some others, public sector employees are left out, right? We want to make sure that the Wagner Act is going to be able to survive long enough to actually change economic relationships between workers and management, right? This is also feared by critics of New Deal reforms, that if public sector employees were allowed union representation, that would unfairly elevate compensation for public employees who are in competition with private enterprise, right? This was one of these arguments that was brought out recently in the last decade or so, when the Obama administration was trying to pass healthcare reform that included a public option. The idea that, all right, well, if you can't buy any of these healthcare options in a free market, there should be a government option available to everyone, not just necessarily limited to income or age. The counter argument that eventually won the day was that if government did that, public companies wouldn't be able to compete with the government. The same was more or less true for the labor market, right? If government can set these very high wages and they can negotiate with unions, who is to who is to keep workers from working for private industries? Eventually, government's just going to establish a monopoly by hoarding all of the labor. This, of course, does not happen, but it's still an argument that exists. Farmers, of course, we're not going to be talking about in too great of detail today, but they are also left out of the Wagner Act. The idea being that if agricultural workers were given collective bargaining rights, same as domestic workers, mind you, that might also threaten the survival of the act. We have to remember that the New Deal coalition very much included impoverished white farmers and impoverished white workers in the southern United States, just as it included ethnic and racial minorities and people of color. And so if you look in the South and you have this very sordid, troubled history of sharecropping and racialized exploitation of agricultural labor, or for that matter, if you look in the Southwest in the Bracero program, again, we're going to be discussing some of these concepts next week, but if you look in the Southwest, a very similar system of racial hierarchy that kind of exploits agricultural labor predominantly performed by workers of color. If you suddenly give these workers bargaining rights, it's entirely possible that this New Deal coalition will start to fall apart, right? And then how long is the Wagner Act going to last? How long is the labor union movement going to last? Now, of course, could be argued, and I think rightfully so, that taking this stance and leaving out scores of workers is incredibly racist. It maintains kind of this hierarchy of white supremacy in the American economy that keeps ethnically diverse workers of color kind of maligned to the bottom rungs of the productive process and of economic activity. And it elevates the opportunities of white workers that non-white workers don't necessarily have. But at the same time, it is worth pointing out that it is not until the Democratic Party stands behind racial equality reforms like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then of course you have the 1968 Civil Rights Act, also known as the Federal Housing Act, creation of the Urban Housing and Development, the Department of Housing and Development, HUD. When the Democratic Party comes out and stands behind all of these acts, and you have Democratic Party support for feminist organizations, you have Democratic Party support for racial equality, that's when this New Deal coalition starts to break down. And in 1968, the Republican Party is able to kind of pivot towards adopting a states' rights stance of government, right? Limited federal government, states' rights to kind of determine how they want to run their own internal affairs. This is appealing to southern state governments who still want to maintain, if not de jure legal segregation, some form of de facto segregation. So the Southern strategy eventually kicks the New Deal coalition out of power after the New Deal coalition aligns itself with civil rights interests. So despite all of these arguments that you can have for omitting certain workers out of coverage from the Wagner Act, despite all of these arguments that you can come up with, the Wagner's Act, this lack of coverage under the Wagner Act, means a lot of these jobs remain low paying. They're very insecure, they're very unstable, it's very hard to make a living off of them. And that leads to a much lower standard of living for a lot of workers who do this kind of work, right? Who work in agriculture, who work in domestic labor, who work for at least a time in public sector employment. They don't have as many benefits. Their wages aren't as high as if you are in, for say, a union in the manufacturing industry. Your wages are going to be much better. Of course, not everyone can just leave a low-paying job for a better-paying job. That's usually when people have complaints about where they work. There's this idea, well, if you don't like it, go find another job elsewhere. What the fact of the matter it amounts to, though, is that not everyone can have a cushy office job. Someone has to dig the ditch on the side of the rural route to make sure that the roads don't get flooded. And just because that worker is doing that job doesn't mean that they don't deserve at least according to someone in the labor movement, doesn't mean that they don't also deserve a fair wage on which they can support their family and live a dignified life, right? So around this basis, you have a lot of workers who start to organize campaigns to defend workers who are not necessarily organized or protected under the Wagner Act. And while the mainstream labor movement is going to keep its distance from these organization campaigns for much of the latter 20th century, in recent years, we've started to see these groups cooperate more closely with one another. And so again, this is just to reiterate something that we discussed at the topic slide, right? The labor movement is primarily focused around manufacturing, skilled trades, and resource extraction. So auto manufacturing, skilled trades in any kind of industry, resource extraction, things like mining. They start to struggle when deindustrialization, automation, and globalization starts to kind of drain membership. There are fewer jobs required. The jobs that are required are being sent first to the South, which is largely non-union, has a lot of right to work laws, but then even further outside of the country, you start to see the establishment of maquiladoras in Mexico. You start to see the outsourcing of a lot of labor, either in manufacturing or communications work to places like China and India, especially as we kind of get closer to this century. So there's a lot of pressure, like we said, being put on the labor movement. Instead of reaching out and largely trying to organize other groups, other kinds of workers, where these, while the manufacturing sector is declining, these other sectors of the economy are growing. Instead of reaching out and trying to organize these things, they kind of dig in their heels and try to protect the manufacturing sector as much as possible. So if we're going to talk about these different types of work, these different types of campaigns, we should probably talk with public sector unionism, because it is the segment of the economy that I would say has probably seen the most change over the last couple decades. Now, when the New Deal coalition was drafting the Wagner Act, Roosevelt and others in his cabinet specifically argued against including public sector workers. Now, outside with the constitutionality of the federal government telling state governments how to conduct their own internal labor relations, FDR specifically said, and I quote, "Upon employees in the federal service," this isn't even state employees, it's just employees of the federal government, "upon employees in the federal service rests the obligation to serve the whole people, whose interests and welfare require orderliness and continuity in the conduct of government activities." To say that, like, if you're going to have a government and you're going to give a government much more power than a government has had before the New Deal, there are certain expectations the public has, right? Namely, that the government is going to stay open and it's going to be able to deliver all of these benefits that it's promising people in exchange for the people giving it greater power. A strike of public employees manifests nothing less than an intent on their part to prevent or obstruct the operations of government. It is unthinkable and intolerable. So according to FDR, right, we're expanding the federal government to provide public service to the country. And if you are coming to the federal government to work, that is going to be your role. You're going to be a public servant. And a public servant does not necessarily strike if wages are more or less agreeable in relation to the rest of the economy, right? If we're more or less providing something relatively close to the prevailing wage, there's not a reason to strike, and so there's not going to be any public sector unions. There is, of course, also this concept that the federal government is democratically elected, and these democratically elected representatives then set federal, state, local, municipal, etc. policy. And so if you are going to lead a strike against those democratically elected officials, you are inherently leading a strike against the will of the American people, right? And that's just unconscionable. So you also have these, in addition to the legal issues, you have these deeper philosophical questions of, well, who necessarily should have the power in public sector labor relations, right? Should it be the people who vote, or should it be the workers? Should it be nameless government bureaucrat 37A? Now, this viewpoint doesn't last forever. Specifically, as the role of state and federal governments continues to expand in the post-war era, the government these new government programs established during the New Deal start to grow and expand. They require an increasingly large administrative bureaucracy, right? You need more and more workers, staff to make this system, this federal government that provides things like Social Security, that provides things like healthcare when Lyndon B. Johnson takes over and sends Medicare into law, Medicaid. You need more workers to run this thing. And if you want workers who are competent, especially in a post-war boom where it's relatively easy to get a pretty good job that you can support your family on, at least until the beginning of the 1970s. Again, you have to modify that if you're a white male worker and you have these wages of whiteness that you can benefit from that women and workers of color don't necessarily get to benefit from, right? But if you're going to keep competent workers in these positions, you have to compensate them fairly well. And this kind of paves the way for greater acceptance and calls to recognize the rights of public workers to collectively bargain. Now, this doesn't mean, I'm not trying to suggest, right, that there aren't public sector unions existing before this post-war era of growth, the 1950s and 60s. Postal workers organized as early as the 1890s. They could lead their own strikes. Strikes like these were technically illegal, but they were incredibly effective, especially because in the 1890s, you didn't have a lot of phones where people could just call instead of sending a letter. You had to send a letter, you had to send a telegram. If you wanted to mail anything, you had to ship it. You couldn't just order it on Amazon and have a gig worker drop it off at your house. It was actually a package that was handled by the Postal Service. Teachers, additionally, teachers organized far earlier than a lot of these later public sector unions, but teachers' unions themselves for a very long time tried to avoid the labor label. They would often refer to themselves as education associations or teacher associations. An association sounds a little more palatable than a union. It perhaps sounds less militant, right? It is less alarmist if you live in a very small town, you have very conservative kind of rural values, to hear that the person who's teaching your child is a member of the National Education Association. It's like, oh, well, that sounds delightful. That sounds very, very small town, down to earth, like my teacher has good values. On the contrary, you have these more kind of industrial unions that emerge later or start organizing teachers, and they have these names like the American Federation of Teachers, Congress of Industrial Organizations. That sounds very militant and very socialistic. For a very long time, teachers' unions try to stay away from that, right? So there are these earlier unions, but their ability to advocate for public sector interests are somewhat limited. They don't have a great deal of power. Now, in 1958, though, you start to see this change, specifically in the city of New York, which has a burgeoning public sector industry. A lot of employees start to demand collective bargaining rights. And it's actually Robert Wagner's son, Robert Wagner Jr., who issues an executive order granting collective bargaining rights to city employees. It's actually known as the Little Wagner Act. Robert Wagner Jr. was actually, and we won't get into this too great in this lecture. If it's something that you're interested in, I would encourage you to look into it. But Robert Wagner Jr. is also credited with kind of breaking up this system of city bosses in New York City politics and kind of paving the way for greater democratic participation on the part of New York City residents. Prior to the 1950s and 60s, New York City politics was pretty much controlled by a couple of special interest groups that kind of like met and discussed how the city would function. They were called city bosses. In addition to passing the Little Wagner Act, this executive order, Robert Wagner Jr. is credited with breaking up this as well. Now, the next year, this spreads to the state of Wisconsin, when that state becomes the first state to extend collective bargaining rights to public employees, right? And this puts greater pressure on the federal government to adopt changes at the federal level that address this issue. A lot of times you see this happening in American history and American politics, where very gradually a city will kind of pave the way for an ordinance. You know, it might be tied to non-discrimination, it might be tied to labor relations, it might be tied to things that are a little more reactionary in politics towards progressive issues, maybe a repeal of an ordinance. State governments will then pick that up. And then once enough state governments come out and say, well, actually, yes, we support this measure. Like, we support the collective bargaining rights of public employees. We support the rights of queer Americans to get married to members of the same sex. Eventually, there's this federal tipping point where either the Supreme Court or an executive order or an act will be signed into law, passed by the legislature and signed into law, that basically, officially, the federal government position is this. So once Wisconsin and some of these other states start to extend collective bargaining rights, you see something very similar when in 1962, President Kennedy passes his own executive order, 10988. If you remember that number, that's great. It's not going to be on the final exam. It's of course because the final exam is not an exam, it's going to be your term paper, so I'm not going to be examining you on this, but if it were, I wouldn't necessarily have that number. But it's important to know that President Kennedy does pass an executive order that extends collective bargaining rights to public sector employees. Now, this represents a substantial breakthrough for public sector workers and leads to many more states legalizing public sector workers' collective bargaining, right? Extending those rights to those workers. Depending on who you ask, right? Depending on who you ask in labor history or in the labor movement, they'll give you two different interpretations of this, right? Either Executive Order 10988 was a good thing because it allowed public workers to collectively bargain, or it was a bad thing because Kennedy's executive order kind of cut off this other legislation known as Rhodes-Johnson, or the Rhodes-Johnson Union Recognition Bill, which would have been the Rhodes-Johnson Union Recognition Act. That's a tongue twister. Basically, the signing of this executive order prevented this more encompassing and radical extension of bargaining rights from being brought to a vote and prevented it from being passed. Now, the bill's success wasn't a foregone conclusion. So depending on who you ask, President Kennedy made sure that public workers had some bargaining rights, or President Kennedy made sure that certain bargaining rights remained unavailable to public sector workers. Regardless of how you view it, though, after 10988, public sector employees were allowed collective bargaining rights. They were allowed to join unions. And there was an expectation, there was a demand set on the federal government to bargain with those unions in good faith, but public sector employees were not permitted to strike. And that remains true. When you look at the news and you see people in AFSCME, it's a union representing federal, state, municipal employees. If you see AFSCME on strike, it's the acronym, or if you see teachers on strike, or at least if those teachers are working for a public school system or for a public state university, if they are on strike, that is technically illegal because public sector workers are not allowed to strike. Should public sector workers be allowed to strike? Do you agree with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Kennedy, or are you a little more to the left? Do you think public sector workers should have unions at all, or are they solely accountable to the voting public? These are just examples of questions that are routinely brought up in some form or another in national discourse when we talk about politics, right? What are the rights of workers? What are the rights of managers, or what are the rights of government? Now, more recently, in these kinds of discussions, the tide has turned back to not entirely to its pre-Wagner era, right? We are still federally, on the federal level, we are allowed to join unions. Some significant states have adopted right to work laws that make unionizing very difficult. But we are still allowed to join unions. But there has been this kind of turn back to the way things, used to be before Wagner, or at least before 10988. In 2018, for example, you had the Supreme Court hear the case Janus versus AFSCME. Supreme Court basically declared that it was unconstitutional for a labor union representing government employees to require dues payments in exchange for representation, right? Dues payments are these things that, as a member of a labor union, you pay a union in exchange for representing you, right? All of the money that they have to pay out for legal consultation, legal representation, research, any sort of expenses that you have in the bargaining practice. It actually takes a lot of money to organize workers and bargain with employers for their interests. And that expense only grows when you have a very labor hostile government kind of mindset. If the zeitgeist of the time is against collective bargaining, it's a lot harder to collectively bargain. So Janus versus AFSCME says, hey, you can't actually require that people in your union, who you are obliged to represent as part of your bargaining unit, you can't actually make them pay you dues payments. And it used to be that you didn't have to join the union, but you had to pay what was known as an association fee, right? I'm not a member of the union. I'm not going to pay the full amount, but I do recognize that I'm benefiting from union representation, so I will be paying a little bit. Those were your two options. Janus versus AFSCME adds this third option for you to just say, you know what, I don't want to pay the union at all. And if a union has reduced incomes, if it can't really spend a lot of money on educational efforts to tell people what the union actually does for them, they're inclined when they're hired to just not join the union because it's this extra pay deduction. And what does the union actually do for me, right? So these kinds of Supreme Court cases or these recent right-to-work legislations are kind of turning back the tide on public sector unionism, you know, as well as unionism in general, but public sector unionism especially. So very, very easily, right, we can see how these kinds of political questions embedded in the 1950s and 60s are still relevant for today. Should postal workers have a union? You're in a labor history class. I think that the general political mindset of the class tends to veer one way or over another, but that can't necessarily be said for general society, right? There are arguments out there that specifically state, no, we shouldn't have unions at all. Labor history would be very different without them, however, I think it is safe to say. That being said, public sector unions have been fairly successful. The largest unions in the country are still public sector unions. If the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, these two different teacher unions, if they were to join up, they would actually be the largest union in American history. I believe right now that title is either held by AFSCME, which is a public sector union, or SEIU, which is kind of a hybrid representing both public and private sector workers. But right, we've talked about public sector union, we've talked about the legality issue, we've talked about the citizenship issue. What other reasons might the labor union, the labor movement decide that workers are unorganizable? Well, maybe I, above other people who might have taught this course, like to infuse gender a little bit extra into things. When we talk about systemic sexism, we talk about systemic misogyny, and we talk about things like the pay gap, glass ceilings. All of these forces kind of, they affect the labor movement as well. Professions that were largely staffed by women, for example, were seen by many, not only in the labor movement, but by society as large, as kind of a form of non-permanent or liminal employment, right? You're not going to be at these jobs forever. As a woman who is working, you know, they would say, you know, well, you know, you're a woman, so you're basically at this job until you find a man. And of course, then you're going to get married, you're going to have a bunch of kids, and then you're not going to be at this job anymore. That, of course, denied those women workers agency to say, actually, I don't want to get married or have kids, and I want to focus on my career. And as an American citizen, that should be my right. It was more this social cultural pressure saying, well, obviously, this culture of domesticity is going to drive you out of the workplace and back into the kitchen, where you're going to be doing all of this reproductive labor and performing all of these institutions still associated with Republican motherhood, right? Everything old is new again, or maybe not new again, just keeps going. So why would the labor movement then, if this was their belief, even though it might not be a true one, why would the labor movement shell out millions of dollars in 1960s, 1970s money to organize women workers if it was entirely believed that, they're just going to leave that job in 2 or 3 more years anyway? Why should we pay to organize them? Now, careers that fall under these feminine stereotypes, they're often referred to pink-collar industries, which we mentioned earlier, right? And this is in contrast to blue-collar and white-collar industries. Pink-collar labor is work that is traditionally considered to be women's work. Blue-collar labor, of course, is manual labor, and white-collar labor is these professional or educated positions, primarily like office workers, clerks, government bureaucrats might be white-collar workers. If you're working in the tech industry today, or if you're an IT worker, you're more than likely a white-collar worker. In relation to blue and white-collar labor, pink-collar labor is usually compensated poorly by comparison. There are a lot of gendered reasons for this, as well as economic reasons. Blue-collar labor, of course, is more dangerous, so those workers deserve to be paid for the hazards that they participate in by working. White-collar labor, of course, is mentally taxing, and so those workers should be compensated for all of the brain muscle power they're expending to put, I suppose at the time it was like cardboard receipts into these giant IBM computers. This kind of argument, of course, overlooks the fact that a lot of white-collar labor is also pink-collar labor. Anyone who's a teacher will tell you how difficult and mentally taxing it is to manage several classes of students over the course of an 8-hour day, only to then go home and do all of this grading, do all of this lesson planning. Teachers today, of course, will also tell you that it is very dangerous being a teacher. We have a spree of education-related shootings up until kids couldn't go to school anymore. So pink-collar labor can easily be mentally taxing and dangerous as well. But on gendered terms, there's this idea, well, it's not actually that hard because women can do it. And, those women aren't going to be at these positions forever, so why really bother with organizing them? Several organizations, however, disagreed with this mindset, and they really come into full force in the 1970s in order to advocate for women who worked. And this wasn't only in pink-collar industries, mind you, but women who worked in all industries, right? If a woman worked in a blue-collar industry that was traditionally masculine, she was still a woman. She would still be discriminated against because of her sex. If you have any doubt on that, I would encourage you to go back and reread Manhood on the Line, because there are very many accounts of sexual harassment in blue-collar workforces, mind you. There's also very many accounts of specific individuals in the union who may or may not have actually viewed sexual harassment and sex-based discrimination as pressing matters. 9 to 5, which was actually popularized by the Dolly Parton song and film of the same name, I believe. 9 to 5 actually started out as an organization known as the National Association of Working Women. It was founded in 1973, and it was established to improve women's working conditions and protect women's rights across all employment industries. It's a very catchy song. It's a very good movie. I would encourage you to check out both if you haven't heard either, or if you've only heard or seen one. The next year, you have the Coalition of Labor Union Women, or CLUW, was founded in 1974, and that was specifically focused on women who were associated with the labor movement, things like the AFL-CIO or the Alliance for Labor Action. Largely defunct by 1974, but still. You also have a lot of unions outside of the AFL-CIO. The goal of CLUW was to protect women's rights, make sure women's voices and considerations were heard in the labor movement, and make sure the labor movement was acting in cooperation with feminist principles and ideals. If you recall that ending chapter from Manhood on the Line, right, where you have many, many incidents of women being accosted and harassed and attacked at work or immediately outside of work, and sometimes unions just saying, well, she shouldn't have led them on. Very clearly, there is a need for an advocacy group that kind of calls unions to task and says, hey, how are you representing your women membership here? Don't they have the same rights as men? 9 to 5 National Association of Working Women, eventually in 1981, teams up with the Service Employees International Union, one of the largest unions in the country today. And they began what's called District 925, which is an aspirational national labor union created to represent office workers and clerical staff who, again, are predominantly women participating in a pink collar industry, which is underrepresented and underpaid, even today. So we've introduced this concept of pink collar labor. What are some examples of pink collar labor? Well, one is working in the airway industry, or in the airway industry, the airline industry, right? If you are working as a flight attendant, you are predominantly kind of pigeonholed into this category of pink collar labor, right? It's an inherently feminine job, and if a man is found working as a flight attendant, there are certain assumptions of his character, of his lifestyle that are made because of it, because it is predominantly pink collar labor. Now, work in the airline industry is something that was already covered under the Railway Labor Act, like we said earlier, right? And so flight attendants at the time, stewards, but more commonly stewardesses, are left out of protection under the Wagner Act. And there are certain outcomes of this that may or may not have been anticipated when the Wagner Act was being framed. Now, again, many in the public saw flight attendants as women who basically, before they were going to get married, were just trying to find some temporary employment so they could save up some money. And at the same time, they were going to be working in an industry that was perceived as, pretty glamorous. Women who worked as flight attendants were widely perceived as being socially desirable. And this is because their actual job kind of revolved around the very social norms of domesticity, right? Especially in the 1930s and 1940s. Flying was not something that was necessarily seen as widely safe. You didn't have a lot of the same practices in the airline industry that you have today, where there's like double checks and triple checks and secondary systems to keep a plane flying in the sky. Back in the 1930s, if your engine went out, you had that other one, and if that one went out, well, these planes aren't very powerful. We don't have enough parachutes. Sorry, folks. So it was a dangerous job, but women being able to have a calm head, and not only have a calm head, but basically assuage their customers' fears, right? Travelers who had never flown before, who were terrified. There's a shake, there's turbulence. Oh God, we're going to die. Flight attendants would be able to calm the nerves of these very masculine, gruff businessmen. If the flight attendant can keep a calm head right now, then I should be able to, right? I'm a man. So flight attendants were seen as these kind of caretakers of domesticity, of having a calm head in very troubling situations. Not only this, but they were able to multitask quite effectively, right? It's very hard to wait on one demanding person. It's much harder to wait on 60. So they had a calm, level head. They were able to demonstrate hospitality. And they were also incredibly conventionally attractive. There were very strict regulations on if you could be a flight attendant, which we're going to get into in a little bit. They basically come out as a result of this work not being covered under the Wagner Act, right? There are certain things that employers are allowed to do that they might not have been able to do if this type of work was covered under the National Labor Relations Act and was overseen by the NLRB. So female flight attendants were actually required to meet these certain beauty standards, right? They governed basically everything. Had to be within a certain age bracket, right? Obviously, you couldn't be too young. You had to be able to actually work and have gainful employment as pursuant to other labor laws. But you couldn't be too old either. If you started to have wrinkles, if you started to have gray hair, or if you just reached the age of 30, a lot of these airline industries would fire you. They would, of course, give you the opportunity to retire gracefully. But if you refuse to do that, they would fire you. They'd find some reason to terminate you and they'd kick you out, or they would very just unabashedly say, well, she's too old to work in the industry, so we had to let her go. There are much more invasive policies as well. Forced retirement is something that you can see across different segments of the labor movement. Maybe not commonly in this country, but in other countries internationally, it's something that's relatively accepted. It's not often used as a way to reinforce gender difference in the labor force. Sometimes in governments, you'll say, well, if you hit 70, you have to retire from public service, right? These sorts of things. But you had much more invasive policies as well that governed, how much you could weigh before a shift. Your employer might tell you to get on the scale, and if you're above a certain weight, you might be grounded, told to lose weight until you can get back into your uniform and start flying again. If you failed to lose weight, you might be fired. Skin color, obviously, was something that was heavily regulated. If anyone knows who the Rockettes were, they were not airline stewards or stewardesses or flight attendants. They were actually a dancing group. For a very long time, despite their national prominence, they were able to get away with not bringing on any African-American members or dancers of color or dancers with disabilities. The idea being, well, there's we're less of an assortment of dancers and more of an actual a unit of we're a collective of bodies that are kind of doing a thing, right? We all dance, we all have this choreography, and we all have to look alike. Similar excuses were used to bar African-American and other workers of color from working in the airline industry, especially as flight attendants. Dentistry was another one. Flight attendants who had been hired on to serve as flight attendants, if they had been dentistry, they would have their teeth filed down for consistency. That sounds horrible. It was horrible, and it was incredibly painful and excruciating, and there are vivid accounts of it in Kathleen Berry's book, Femininity in Flight, if you're interested in reading them, but I won't get too much into them here. Not only these facets of personal appearance, right? If you were not old enough to be forcefully retired yet, if you did get married, you would be fired, right? The expectation being, well, of course, you're going to go home, going to inhabit the domestic sphere now. The other is if you became pregnant, they would fire you. So there weren't a lot of labor protections. There weren't a lot of guarantees of workplace dignity even. And one might expect that as air travel becomes more frequent and commonplace, these types of exclusionary policies are going to start to die down, right? Obviously, now that you have more planes flying in the sky, you're not going to be able to have these incredibly sexist anti-woman policies as a part of your employment procedure, because these jobs aren't going to be as desirable, right? It's going to be harder to get enough workers to fill these jobs if there are more of them available. Of course, actually, the opposite is true. As air travel becomes more commonplace, airline industries actually put greater investment in beauty standards of their flight attendants as an ability to kind of market themselves above their competitors. So in these pictures here, right, at the bottom and on the top right, you have these very kind of older pictures of flight attendants, of airline stewardesses, these very kind of uniformed policies, right? You have to look a certain way, you have to behave a certain way, there's a certain degree of decorum. This doesn't go away in the 60s and 70s, as you can see on the top left, it actually remains. Now you might have this groovy degree of diversity where you can have flight attendants have different length hair, different color hair. They might even have a tan a little bit, but there's still going to be that commodification of human bodies for financial benefit, right? The airline industry is able to sell more tickets partly because all of their ads are able to show airline stewards and stewardesses, specifically stewardesses still at this time, that have a certain aesthetic about them. And this, of course, is created exclusively on the back of flight attendant labor. Right? All these promotional materials that you see on the right-hand side here don't actually show slides at the same time of women having their teeth filed down to meet the beauty standards of the airlines. Now, because of the predominantly women-centered employment of flight attendants and the social assumptions of this limited kind of temporary employment. Obviously, you're going to find a man and you're going to leave the job, or we're going to kick you out. There was not the same urgency with the labor movement to organize flight attendants as there was with, airline pilots, or even railroad engineers or sleeping car porters, right? If you recall A. Philip Randolph, he organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. There was not a industry equivalent for all female flight attendants at that time. Now, you did eventually have the creation of organizations like the Airline Stewards and Stewardess Associations, or ALISA, but they didn't actually have a lot of authority. A lot of times they were viewed as like these rubber stamp unions because they were overseen and dominated by much larger male-centric unions like the Airline Pilots Associations, or ALPA. And these could be basically unresponsive to the concerns of women workers if they didn't just overlook them entirely. Now, because of this limited interest in organizing, also because of pervasive sexism and a high degree of employer repression, the forced turnover for aging workers, all of these things, right? In addition to anti-labor hostility that kind of picks up after Taft-Hartley, ALISA only really has, they have less than 5,000 members in the 1950s. And it's worth keeping in mind that this is really a high point for union organizing in the labor movement. Operation Dixie ends up being defeated in the 1950s, but the labor movement is growing pretty rapidly in other parts of the country. And it's also worth remembering that public sector unionism is starting to expand at this time too. But it's not going to be until the 1970s, right at the height of the second wave feminist movement, the same year that 9 to 5 as an organization is picking off, the year before the Coalition of Labor Union Women is founded. It's not until the 1970s that ALISA is going to choose to leave ALPA and become its own independent union, and that's the Association of Flight Attendants. The Association of Flight Attendants is the union that represents flight attendants today. And this vote to self-determination actually struck down decades of sex-based discrimination within the union and the workplace, right? If you're not being overseen by ALPA, which had, they weren't necessarily hostile to ALSSA. They didn't hate members of ALISA, they just didn't see the point necessarily of organizing them at the time. But once you're able to kind of get out from under that male-dominated oversight, you're able to actually organize effectively without being, without your parent union running interference, without saying, no, you can't do that strike, no, you can't organize those workers, it's not worth fighting for. The AFA is actually able to grow substantially. By the end of the 20th century, 20 or so years after their departure from ALPA, they grow to nearly 50,000 members. That's more than a 10-fold increase in just a couple decades. Now, at the same time that the AFA becomes its own independent union, it also has to grapple with a couple of negative trends. Like we said, the New Deal coalition starts to fall apart at the end of the 1960s into the early 1970s. Now you have the emergence of this Southern strategy that brings kind of like business-oriented, not New Deal-oriented, but business-oriented Republicans into greater federal power. The abilities of labor unions to organize isn't necessarily crushed at this point, but it starts to decline a little bit. There's greater anti-labor hostility at this point. With the end of the New Deal coalition, the rise of this conservative movement, which is more to a backlash of feminist advocacy and principles, flight attendants have to organize in a period of increasing anti-labor and anti-woman hostility. And this hostility isn't aimed at flight attendants alone, mind you, right? If you haven't read it yet, you will be very soon. Eric Loomis's chapter on the PATCO strike. In the 1980s especially, government takes a very hard stance against the labor movement, despite the fact that Ronald Reagan, I believe, including up till today, though I'm not sure if Joe Biden has been in a union, but of course he's not inaugurated yet either. I believe Ronald Reagan was the only president who was actually a member and president of a union local. Of course, his administration takes an incredibly anti-labor line. The federal government kind of retreats from enforcing NLRA rules, and businesses take advantage of that, and labor participation, labor strikes, and labor organizing sharply declines. It's actually in this environment the AFA has to do a lot of its organizing. Federal deregulation of the airline industry doesn't help either, because a lot of new airline startups are able to come into creation or to merge with other airlines and become a new organization. And because they are a new employer, they don't have an existing union recognized with their employees, they're able to kind of just, in ways that earlier airlines could not do, they are able to forestall unionization, prevent unionization, fire workers who are trying to join unions. And so these anti-labor precedents don't help the AFA either. But the kind of organizing that they do has been incredibly effective. Sarah Nelson, who's the American Flight Attendant Association head today, you see her in the bottom picture there, has been incredibly militant in comparison to AFL-CIO stalwarts, right? Richard Trumka, who's the president of the AFL-CIO today, he's done a number of rounds on Fox News. He has a very kind of moderate stance in the labor movement. Sarah Nelson, by contrast, when the COVID pandemic was kicking off, was telling the AFL-CIO, we need to have a general strike, right? The scary term that shakes the boots of a lot of people opposed to the labor movement. We need to have a general strike if we're going to win the demands that the American people are asking for. So what other examples of pink-collar industries are there? If you said domestic workers in that brief, exasperated pause, then good job, you got it right. If you didn't, the answer is domestic workers. Now, unorganizable workers, quote unquote, unorganizable workers in other industries included domestic workers, and they could be both live-in domestic workers or people who actually lived with the families they were employed by, as well as domestic workers who commuted to the houses they worked at. And this could be one house, this could be several houses. Right? If you were working as a nanny or like a sitter for children, you might only work at one house for the duration of a day. Or if you were working as someone who cleaned houses but didn't necessarily like cook meals or take care of children, you might be working at a bunch of different houses. Now, domestic labor, similar to agricultural labor, because it was racialized, was excluded from the Wagner Act. The Democratic Party wanted to keep that New Deal coalition together, and so by excluding certain types of predominantly feminine and racialized labor, or just racialized labor that was agriculturally based, they could keep enough people on board to make sure that the Wagner Act was passed long enough for it to be kind of secured as the law of the land. Now, domestic workers, especially in the southern United States, were disproportionately African American and other workers of color. In the Southwest, you also see Latin American workers filling a lot of these roles. And this work was often infrequent and performed on a sporadic basis. Now, since domestic workers negotiated for employment on an informal basis directly with their employing families, work could come with a lot of conditions, and a lot of times they could be illegal, right? Well, ma'am, I see you're desperate for a job, and I am willing to hire you to clean our house, but I'm going to pay you below the minimum wage. I'm going to actually ask you to work more than 8 hours a day, and I'm actually going to, this isn't in writing, of course, but I'm going to get home 2 hours before my wife, and I'm going to need some things from you. If you're cringing looking at the screen, that is the appropriate response to have. If you didn't cringe, you probably weren't paying attention, so go ahead and rewind that video about 2 minutes. It's pretty common practice. Now, domestic workers, because of the nature of their employment, right, because they're socially and economically isolated from their peers and community members, either because they're living in these houses or because they're traveling to these houses and working in isolation, working in exclusion, it was very hard for non-union, more community-focused organizers to actively like reach workers and hear their interests and canvass and get them to join any sort of nascent organizations that might represent their interests, right? If you wanted to organize a blue-collar institution, if you wanted to organize workers at a factory, you might go to the bar after a shift. You might go to the union hall. Or you might create a union hall where people could come to, right, if there wasn't one already existing. Or you might stand outside the factory gates and leaflet as people are coming in or leaving shifts. It's a lot harder to do this with domestic workers because there's not one central workplace. There's not one gathering space. Domestic workers were subject to a lot of physical, verbal, and even sexual abuse. These also posed frequent challenges. Now, if you're going to organize domestic workers, you're going to have to kind of leave industrial union practices at the door. Now, for the first semester of this class, the first part of the semester of this class, a lot of our focus has been this gradual evolution from community unionism, right, that we see under the Knights of Labor, to craft unionism that we see under the AFL, to industrial unionism, first that we see with the UMW to a degree, but also to the IWW, and then to this Congress of Industrial Organizations in the 30s, right? We've kind of treated the emergence of industrial unionization as this be-all, end-all of the labor movement. But the struggle to organize industries like domestic workers proved that industrial unionism has its weaknesses, right? If you want to organize a bunch of workers in one industry at one place, that's incredibly easy. It is not easy when all of those workers are isolated, right? So a lot of organizers who are fighting for the rights of domestic workers have to take an almost a community union approach in their efforts, right? They have to speak with workers on an individual basis. They have to go to community events. They have to work with non-labor focused community organizations. There is a lot of cooperation between organizers who are trying to represent domestic workers in the civil rights movement, for example, the feminist movement as well. Because domestic workers are outside of the labor NLRA Wagner Act protections. A lot of times if you wanted to win domestic workers protections or workplace rights, you had to go through legislative halls, you had to reach out to representatives, you had to pressure other representatives to agree to support a bill. It's very much more akin to the Knights of Labor and the National Labor Union, of the community union and the political union days, than it is more reminiscent of like the steel workers. A lot of domestic labor was hired out on this personal basis, as we said. So protecting workers, even if you couldn't get this legislation passed, might just be circulating, like a blacklist. Nothing nefarious like McCarthyism, for example, right? But if a domestic worker was working for a family and the husband tried to assault the domestic worker while his wife was away, maybe that family would be added to a list so that all the other domestic workers knew not to work for them. So these types of community organized, community union focused advocacy efforts start to have a lot more applicability as we get closer to the present day. The person you see on the left here is Dorothy Lee Bolden, and she was the founder of a group known as the National Domestic Workers Union of America. Now, the National Domestic Workers Union of America was very closely tied to the civil rights movement. It does not exist today, but it has a successor organization known as the Domestic Workers National Alliance. And again, they are very much a labor union, but they are not an NLRB, Wagner Act, United Steelworkers, CIO union. They're much more like a community union because the legal parameters of collective bargaining, the way the NLRB and the Wagner Act work, mean that any sort of association representing domestic workers has to operate a little bit differently. Now, Bolden was very vocal about being proud of her work. She took a lot of care in the quality that she presented. She was very proud of that. She was also forced to contend with constant threats of harassment, attempts of imprisonment, racial terror. In the 1940s, Bolden actually refused to stay late and wash dishes for her boss, who was a white woman. And this woman actually called the police to have Bolden arrested, claiming that Bolden was mentally unfit and needed to be psychiatrically evaluated. Now, in Bolden's own words, she says, quote, "They told me I was crazy because I had talked back to a white woman and called in some psychiatrists to prove it. A white woman's word was gospel, and 2 psychiatrists actually thought I was crazy. This was the way you got locked up. This was the system." So even if, for a lot of domestic workers, even if you organized and joined an association, joined an aspirational union like the National Domestic Workers Union, or a participant in the civil rights movement, if you did your work well and took a lot of pride in it, and if there were legal, even outside the purview of the Wagner Act, if there were labor laws that restricted how many hours you could work in a day, if you said, you know, I've worked 8 hours today, I'm going home, I can't stay late, your boss, using that racial privilege, using that racialized agency, can have you thrown in jail or even in a mental institution because you're talking back. That's the kind of degree of workplace discrimination and harassment that people who were not covered by the Wagner Act and are not covered by the Wagner Act still have to kind of deal with here. In 1965, the federal government passed the Immigration and Nationality Act. This is also known as the Hart-Celler Act. The Hart-Celler Act abolished the previous system of immigration quotas that were based on national origin that overwhelmingly favored European immigration against populations from the global south, right? So this idea that population limits on immigration were tied to the amount of population of a group in the United States already. So there were a lot of people from England, so you could have a lot of people from England moving to the United States. You, of course, have the Chinese Exclusion Act up for a very long time, well into the 1930s, 1940s, that prevent Chinese labor from coming to the United States. And so there's a very small amount of Chinese workers. That means the ratio to immigration cap on workers who can come in from China is going to be incredibly small. It was a very racialized system. Hart-Celler does away with it, kind of. It's going to be reformed a little bit later, and some of the problems that Hart-Celler still has in 1965 are also going to be fixed. But new immigrants arrived in the United States. They start to take on some of these jobs in domestic service. We mentioned that in the American Southwest, there's a similarly entrenched system of racialized disparity in labor that targets Latin American workers. This is going to come in full force in these kinds of hospitality or domestic worker related industries, right? And there's this added nexus of legality or documentation. This isn't new, right? Discussions about demands for papers from corrupt border police, threats of deportation and family separation are not new to 2016. They've kind of been going on. And again, this is something we're going to be able to talk about in a little more detail next week, especially when we talked about the Bracero program. But if you've been reading along with Loomis, he's also talked about this a little bit with IWW campaigns in the Southwest. You have, for example, lynchings of unionists. You have forced deportations of people who very well may have been American citizens, but despite this, because they have a different racial or ethnic makeup, they're just kind of forced south of the border. These forces are also applied to workers in the domestic industry, especially if they start to get too demanding for rights and dignity at the workplace, right? In Atlanta, Georgia, with Bolden, it was you're psychiatrically unfit. In the American Southwest, in like areas by the Gadsden Purchase or in California or Las Vegas, it's because you're an undocumented immigrant. We need to deport you, even though you might actually have documentation. There will be ways to get you out of the country. And so these only serve to exacerbate existing inequalities. So the Hart-Celler Act was very much a good thing for egalitarianism and equality in the immigration process, a step in the right direction. It also enables substantial racial discrimination in a lot of, it doesn't enable it, but it emboldens it in a lot of unorganizable, quote unquote, industries, right? Now, community-based networks of domestic work and activism, as we have said, they intersected a little bit with the civil rights movement and the women's movement. With the emergence of the Hart-Celler Act and immigration-based discrimination, these community-based networks of domestic worker activism are going to also work alongside the rights movement too. And this is this cooperation between labor and non-labor focused social advocacy groups, community coalitions, engagement in electoral politics. A lot of labor historians and labor organizers and people working with the labor movement are starting to wonder if this is the new trend in labor organizing, right? Are we moving away from industrial unionism and back kind of towards a community-based unionism that is more than just this community-based, but it's like social movement-based unionism? Now, progressive organizations like the National Domestic Workers Alliance, that was the successor to Bolden's initial union drive. They continue to advocate for domestic worker protections. And they do this by including members across entire communities, like we said, right? This community kind of approach. It's not the community-based unionism of the Knights of Labor, because you don't have National Domestic Workers Alliance Las Vegas, and that represents every worker in Las Vegas. It's not quite like that, but it's much more tied to the community. And for workers who participate slightly less formally with the labor market than traditionally unionized workers, right? Public sector employees, blue collar employees, participants of something known as the gig economy, this sort of organization strategy works much better for them. So if positions within the gig economy start to grow as a share of the labor market, this type of organizing might be more and more necessary. We've talked about the gig economy a little bit in class discussions already, but if you weren't able to attend those discussions, the gig economy is a labor market characterized by the prevalence of short-term contracts or freelance works as opposed to permanent jobs, right? So if you are working as an artist that is paid on commission, that is an example of a job in the gig economy. If you drive for Uber, that is an example of a job in the gig economy. DoorDash, Uber Eats, all these other services, Lyft, they're examples of jobs in the gig economy as well. Temp workers are another good example of a job in the gig economy, right? A temp worker is a worker who is hired to a company that has like a temporary part-time need for extra labor. The idea being there might be a pathway for you to hire on full-time, but for most part-time workers, regardless of how hard they work, that opportunity seems to constantly be out of grasp. If you've worked for a temp agency or as a temp worker, you might know what I'm talking about here. Temp workers, of course, have been used increasingly in the manufacturing industry. The latest strike between the UAW and GM, part of their the sticking point that led to the strike lasting for as long as it did was GM wouldn't commit to hiring thousands of temp workers that they had working there for years on end at some of these plants. The labor movement's relationship to the gig economy reflects wider issues over agency and workplace dignity. And those are tied also along with conceptions of skill and employment, right? Do gig workers deserve the same rights as workers employed on a consistent basis? Some might say no, because a worker who is not employed on a permanent basis can just walk away whenever they want to, right? You might just wake up one day and look at your Uber app and not open it and say, I don't feel like working today. The same, of course, could be said for a lot of workers in a lot of different jobs today. This isn't to say that you're going to have a job guaranteed after you just decide not to go in for a shift, but absenteeism is a facet of workplace life across the board. It isn't just exclusive to gig workers, right? Something to think about. So we've talked about public sector workers. We've talked about airline flight attendants and domestic workers who are part of this pink collar industry. How about what is perhaps the largest group of workers in the country today? The service workers. A big chunk of service workers actually work in the retail industry. If you don't know what the retail industry is, basically go to Kohl's, go to Target, go to Meijer. It's where you buy things. Cashiers, people who stock shelves. A lot of times people just associate retail work with grocery stores. It's more than that. Anyone who's worked in back house of a Walmart knows how hard people unloading those giant trucks have to work to make sure that all your kids can get those PlayStation 5s in time. Workers employed in retail and customer service industries could also be met with apathy from the labor movement. And this is despite some retail workers being represented by different national unions throughout a lot of American history, right? That one of the earlier examples we have of unionized retail workers is in the Retail Clerks International Union, or RCIU. It was founded a little bit before the AFL, and it joins the American Federation of Labor in 1890. And much to the degree of the labor movement does in general terms, the Retail Clerks International Union has its own kind of split between craft and industrial union approaches. In the 1930s, the RCIU expels a bunch of locals in New York who start to advocate for industrial unionism. That is to say, hey, anyone who works in retail should be unionized, not just people who work behind the meat counter, or not just people who work at the jewelry counter in some of these fancy department stores, but the porters who carry boxes up and down flights of stairs, who operate freight elevators, who are bagmen, who are cashiers, right? All of these jobs that are quote unquote unskilled, don't require a lot of training in order to perform well. They should also be allowed to join unions. The RCIU says, no, we disagree. That's a dangerous road. You're going towards socialism. Get out of our union. In 1937, these expelled locals, instead of just disbanding, join the CIO, as the United Retail Employees of America. Now, retail workers' unions were essential in winning the fight to normalize the 40-hour work week during the Great Depression. Now, there was a huge push in the manufacturing industry, right? You have the Flint sit-down strike, you have the Battle of the Overpass and the against Ford. Ford eventually unionizes in 1941. The government looks like it's going to be giving a lot of defense contracts to some of these other more union-friendly companies, so Ford eventually folds. But for a long time, a lot of people were saying that the 8-hour day needed to be adopted by manufacturing because that was harder work. That maybe jobs that were not as physically demanding did not necessarily deserve the 8-hour workday. Retail workers were actually instrumental in challenging this concept. Now, the 8-hour day had become increasingly seen as a mainstream concept by the point that we're in the Great Depression. But retail workers' unions were essential in extending the idea of collective bargaining rights and the idea of extending prevailing wage rates and the idea of extending these sorts of guarantees to retail workers when they struck at stores like Woolworth's and Gimbel's. The Woolworth sit-down strike in 1937 actually occurred in Detroit and achieved some national notoriety. It inspired similar sit-down strike waves throughout the industrial Northeast and the Midwest. You have a massive sit-down wave in New York City occurring later in the year in 1937 after the success of the sit-down strike at Woolworth's. Now, despite some of these modest gains by retail workers and their unions, public perceptions of retail workers as either young women awaiting marriage, or just young people who are starting off as their first job and don't necessarily need to be organized because they're gonna, they're gonna go to school, they're gonna get training, and they're gonna get a better job. They tended to stymie arguments that retail workers deserved a livable wage. So again, Detroit in 1937, retail workers staged a massive sit-down at the Woolworth's department store. It lasts for about a week. And the company is forced to agree to a couple of major concessions and recognize the union representing the striking workers. This, of course, is despite the fact that this union is largely made up of young women and not of these, blue-collar, very kind of labor-oriented, masculine working men. Is the labor movement a place? Does the labor movement have a place for them as well? Nowadays, we would say, of course, sure, but that wasn't always a given. And women who wanted to have employment that was protected by collective bargaining and protected by unions, where it was compensated well, that was not always a foregone conclusion. That actually required a great deal of effort and fight on their part. Now, a successful campaign at Woolworth's, like I said, inspired similar drives in New York City department stores and other department stores across the country. That being said, these strikers were ridiculed in the media, and they weren't provided with a lot of support. by the mainstream labor movement. Woolworths, while it was forced to agree to a series of concessions in the short term, this union that represented striking women at Woolworths did not have staying power. They didn't get a lot of resources from the AFL or the CIO. There wasn't a lot of belief that these girls needed a union or needed a family wage that the AFL and CIO had been arguing for in other sectors of the economy. And so actually later that year, despite the victory at Woolworths, the company was actually defeated by Woolworths. Not the company, sorry. The union was defeated by the company. They went into their next round of, before the Treaty of Detroit, we have these annual series of contracts every year. We're going to return and we're going to renegotiate this contract. The next round of contracts that this union goes up against, the company just shuts them down. We're not actually going to bargain with you. We're going to use all of these tactics that had been very successfully implemented in other anti-union drives prior to the Wagner Act. And because you don't have a lot of popular or financial or material support behind you, you're not going to be able to fight us that well. And so Woolworths eventually crushes the union. In the post-war era, a lot of retail workers benefited from what's known as the prevailing wage. I mentioned this a little bit ago. But the prevailing wage was tied to industrial manufacturing. And basically, as the economy in America began to boom after the war, there was this drive to raise wages if you wanted to retain good workers at your company, right? Why would I work for minimum wage at this nickel and dime store if Chrysler, which is 3 blocks away, is hiring and I can get paid 3 times as well, have a union, have a pension, have healthcare, have other benefits? Or I can come here and stand on, I'm also standing on my feet for 10 hours a day. But in addition to being yelled at by angry customers instead of a small series of supervisors, I am also being paid much less. I also don't get a pension. My health care is maybe not there. So these kinds of pressures, they drive wage compensation. They drive employment compensation up for people who are outside of the manufacturing industry, right? The prevailing wage is this hourly wage, usual benefits and overtime, paid to the majority of workers. Laborers, mechanics, all these workers in a particular area. We go back to this previous slide, right? Here on the bottom right, you see manufacturing, which is nominally high paid, union represented. Manufacturing as a percentage of all US employment drops from 40% in the 1950s to a little less than 10% by the end of the century. It's actually less than 10% today. It actually dropped off. Manufacturing, a segment of US employment, dropped off considerably after 2000. We kind of had a second wave of deindustrialization that occurred in the country after we started to sign free trade agreements like NAFTA, negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that basically allowed companies to globalize and move production outside of the United States entirely. So manufacturing again drops off. All of this, of course, is to say, though, that as the country deindustrializes, as the country gears up for automation and globalization, these manufacturing wage rates start to decline. There's less of them, there's fewer of them, and that actually drops the prevailing wage. So before, if workers were seen as, they didn't need a union because they weren't going to be in this job for very long, either because they were young workers or because they were, of course, going to be married and they're going to stay at home because who is going to have children and do all this reproductive labor and work? That's impossible. All of these factors kind of coalesce to drive down the prevailing wage, which in lieu of union representation and union negotiated wage rates was really what retail workers could depend on for workplace dignity and adequate compensation. There's a series of reforms in the 1960s and 1970s that actually deregulate the retail industry as well. They make getting credit for most Americans more accessible, but it also has the benefit of making it possible for these giant big box stores to undersell higher paying, more specified department and small stores, right? Nowadays, we don't go to the butcher and then go to the produce market and then go to the bakery and then go to these other places when we go shop. Or we don't go downtown and go on this, on these different floors of these different department stores for different things. We go to Meijer, we go to Walmart, we go to Target, but they have a little bit of everything, and that's where most of the shopping is done. These big box stores did not exist prior to the 1960s and 1970s. There were certain financial and retail regulations that prevented them from existing, but once those are done away with, you have these box stores that are created, and they're able actually to hire out labor at a much cheaper rate and offer much cheaper products that are able to undersell these previous more labor-friendly stores that then start to go out of business, right? Hudson's department store, which no longer exists, of course, is one example of one of these department stores that went under because it wasn't able to compete with a deregulated big box retail industry. Today, 29 million Americans work in retail directly. That's about a fifth of the actual workforce, 18.5%, a little less than a fifth. And another 42 million jobs, or another 25, 26 something percent, are tied directly to the retail industry. So you might not necessarily work in retail, but you might be working in transportation, right? You might be one of the drivers that takes these products to these different stores. It's a pretty big segment of the workforce. It's a pretty big segment of the economy. And while not all retail workers are paid their state or federal minimum wage, some stores actually pay considerably higher than the minimum wage in order to keep some workers who are skilled at their positions. The retail industry overall remains incredibly undercompensated, unstable, and has a consistently higher turnover than other industries in the economy. Older unions like the RCIU, which had expelled the UREA, the craft and the later industrial union representing retail workers, they eventually settled their business. They buried the hatchet and they merged to join the UCFW, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. And this is in an effort to better represent retail and other service workers. The UCFW's membership today rests at just under 1.3 million, which is actually pretty big, right? You have to keep in mind that the UAW today, back in the 1950s, they had 2.5 million members. Today, including retirees, they have a little less than 1 million. So the UFCW is bigger than the UAW. But this 1.3 million membership mark also makes the retail industry among the lowest organized sectors nationally. 1.3 million of 29 million is about 4% of retail workers. So 4% of retail workers unionized is much lower than the national average of 10.3 workers unionized across the country. So again, when you read Fow's Rethinking the American Labor Movement, when you read about these missed opportunities, try and visualize where the labor movement might have been today if service sector economy organizing was given a higher priority. Not necessarily the top priority, but really consider what the missed opportunity was here, right? Again, in addition to these existing justifications that retail workers were primarily women workers, of course, they're just going to be leaving this job eventually and they're going to be marrying and they're going to be settling down, or maybe they're just young workers and they need to get some experience before they get quote unquote a real job. I would refer you to this handy infographic of who works in minimum wage jobs, which are primarily retail or service-oriented economy jobs. We do have a stereotype, right? Obviously, if we're going to work at, or if we're going to go get our groceries at Kroger, the cashier is going to be a teenager who's just working part-time after school, lives with his parents, he doesn't have to pay rent, just wants some extra spending money. Actually go to Kroger and see if you see any of those people working on the cash register. You're not going to see many of them because a lot of people working in the retail economy, a lot of people working in the service industry are not teenagers. They're actually 35. A lot of them are more than 20 years old. A lot of them are 35 or older. Most are women. Most work full time, and most do not live with their parents. This actual infographic is tied to raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. It's not specifically related to organizing workers at a specific at a specific employed industry. But who's calling for the minimum wage to be raised to $15 an hour? That's actually a different labor federation that is outside of the AFL-CIO. In 2005, a collection of unions within the AFL-CIO all decided that they were going to leave, and they were going to found their own labor federation. This is kind of a repeat of the Alliance for Labor Action, right? Which itself was kind of a repeat of the Congress of Industrial Organizations. This new coalition, Change to Win, basically said the AFL-CIO, it's too business unionist, right? It's too focused on these workers who are already unionized, or these workers who are already being compensated well. And the AFL-CIO is doing a good job of defending their interests, but what about workers who are outside of the labor movement? What about workers who aren't organized? In 2005, Change to Win was organized, not to put a pun on it, but to change the labor movement to win. CTW has seen some measured success, but not enough success to where there haven't been discussions about re-merging the CTW with the AFL-CIO. Whenever you have these breaks in the labor movement, even if it's for pragmatic reasons like, organizing people who are underrepresented, or taking up new approaches to unionizing that are more community-based and might yield better results than traditional industrial organizing. It comes with this caveat that the labor movement is now divided, right? The AFL-CIO in 1955, despite the fact that they had very two contrasting approaches for organizing workers in the labor movement, they merged in 1955 because they were under political attack. Right? You have Taft-Hartley, you have the failure of Operation Dixie, you have this general anti-labor hysteria that comes with anti-communist hysteria of the Red Scare and the McCarthy era that takes off in 1950. Remember, the second Red Scare starts before McCarthy shows up. And so there's this fact that, well, these labor unions very well might be striking out, might be making bold innovations, and might be having some successes, that the labor movement as a whole, with competition between these two federations, is now divided and very well might be weaker. The CTW, though, some of its more notable drives you may have actually heard of. Fight for 15. They have been not necessarily the sole champion of, but they have contributed a great deal to that effort. Fight for 15 is aimed at retail and fast food workers, participants of the gig economy who are notoriously underpaid. Change to Win has been one of the leading organizations trying to organize workers at Walmart, which is still America's largest private employer with 2.1 million workers. It's second overall only to the Department of Defense, which is, of course, a public employer. It's run by the government, at least for now. And again, as gig economy jobs continue to take up a greater share of the American labor market, it's entirely possible that this previous order of NLRB-based elections and election oversight and industrial organizing might just end up being less and less impactful over time. So Change to Win, despite the criticism that can be leveled about it for leaving the AFL-CIO and forming their own organization, is actually trying some of these bolder approaches to organizing that they feel they need to actually try out. How effective these efforts are going to be, how much staying power they're going to have, anyone can say, right? There's always things that can happen in the news. There's always things that can happen in history that are perhaps unanticipated. Not a lot of people expected the COVID pandemic, for example. But right, that brings us kind of to our takeaways here, right? For much of American labor history, certain sectors of the economy were deemed unorganizable. This includes the industries we talked about today, also agriculture, which we'll be talking about next week. This was partly due to a number of reasons: legal complications, the organizing drives of unorganizable workers could inspire, stereotypes that surrounded specific jobs and specific types of labor, or whether or not Americans at large wanted certain types of workers to be represented by the labor movement. As the United States moved into the post-war era, professions within the service sector of the economy grew that could be in public and private sectors of employment. At the same time, manufacturing and demand for other industrial labor began to incline. This was due to deindustrialization, automation, and globalization coming a little bit later. Now, there was a focus on protecting union gains in blue-collar industries like manufacturing and resource extraction, right? We have steel production, auto work, the rubber industry, we have mining. All these types of jobs, though, start to contract. There are fewer of them available with deindustrialization and automation and advances made in the productive process that require fewer workers. As time went on, the share of manufacturing in the national economy began to shrink so much that the labor movement lost a lot of its political power. And that's led some historians, like Fau and others, to characterize labor's refusal to kind of turn toward the unorganizable. Their refusal to organize the unorganized is very much a lost opportunity. Now today, some unions are incorporating a number of community and movement-based approaches to organize workers in industries that were previously viewed as too volatile, too precarious, retail and domestic service included, but many others. The labor movement seemingly remains divided over the practicality of these approaches. If you want evidence of that, just look at the difference between the AFL-CIO and Change to Win. Of course, recapping on some vocabulary that we talked about in the lecture, pink-collar labor is a term denoting work that is traditionally considered to be women's work. This is in contrast to blue-collar labor, which is manual labor, and white-collar labor, which is like professional, educated labor, primarily in office positions, but isn't feminine gendered by society. Pink-collar labor is usually compensated poorly in comparison to labor that's traditionally understood to be masculine and performed by men. A little bit of a note here, sometimes you'll hear gray collar and green collar. Gray collar is basically used to refer to supervisory staff, and green collar is basically used to refer to new jobs in growing green industries. So like people who install wind turbines or manufacture solar plants. These are all green collar jobs that are nominally blue collar. Gray collar jobs are nominally white collar. They're just like kind of off. The gig economy is a labor market characterized by the prevalence of short-term contracts or freelance work as opposed to permanent jobs. This isn't just necessarily driving for Uber or Lyft. Can be working on commission as an artist or a writer. Can be working as a temp worker for organizations like Manpower. We also have the prevailing wage. The prevailing wage is the hourly wage accompanied by usual benefits, overtime pay, these sorts of things that are paid to the majority of workers in an area. If a prevalent industry that is more higher paying, like manufacturing, starts to decline, that prevailing wage is also going to decline, and all workers across an area are going to start to see reduced pay and benefits over time. This really happens with deindustrialization, when it was a process that started to speed up with automation and globalization in the 90s. So for next class, make sure you take the lecture quiz by the 23rd to make sure you get that participation credit. Read Loomis's 10 Strikes. Chapter 9 is the air traffic controllers and the new assault on unions. That's going to be that discussion of the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Also, go ahead and start reading Lettuce Wars. That's by Neuberger. It's about the United Farm Workers and their struggle to represent agricultural workers. We're going to be talking about that more in our next discussion. And of course, we're also going to be talking about that in our next lecture. So go ahead and read the introduction and get to chapter 3. And start thinking about the outline for your term paper. That outline is going to be due on the 30th, which is not the class for this lecture, but will be the one after. But of course, it's always good to get a head start on some of these things. All these due dates are going to be closer than they appear. I, of course, am available to answer any questions that you might have, so feel free to shoot me an email, drop by office hours, or send me a message on Canvas if you need help with anything. I'm always available for any kind of assistance I can give.